When the Beatles first exploded in the early 1960s, they did so with such musical, cultural, and, well, financial impact that it was really only a matter of time before unscrupulous parties tried to cash in on that fame and fortune with unlicensed products of all kinds. Look around on Discogs or eBay and you'll find any number of counterfeit Beatles records, things from compilations to even some of their more notorious albums. Yes, this one is a fake. But one of the more famous counterfeit versions of a Beatles album is Introducing the Beatles. I've read somewhere that this is the most counterfeited album of all time. There are countless numbers of web pages dedicated to helping you identify whether or not your VJ version of this album is real. Real quickly though, one of the easier telltale signs whether or not you're Introducing the Beatles is real or fake is whether or not George casts a shadow and or how much of Paul's hand you see down there. The counterfeiters literally just cut the picture out of the original album, made a new cover, and then pressed the audio on their new fake versions. But another interesting aspect on those trying to cash in on the Beatles through the 60s and 70s is this concept of the Beatles sound-alike record. This is not the Beatles, but it's made to look and quite frankly sound like them. I can just imagine some teenagers in the mid-60s saying, "Mom, Dad, please buy me a Beatles record." And the unknowing parents or grandparents come home with something like this. This particular one is by a group called the Bugs. Now, technically, that band never existed. It was just a creation of the record label trying to cash in on the whole beatlemania craze. In actuality, the music on this record came from a group called the Coachman 5. Cornet Records essentially hijacked this album after it was recorded and released it under the title The Beatle Beat, misspelled there, of course, by the Bugs. Now, according to Discogs, in the Bugs was a young musician named Gary Wright, who found that whole experience so jarring that he actually left music for a while to go back to college before coming back into the music scene and helping form a band called Spooky Tooth. You may also know Gary Wright from his more popular solo work, including Dreamweaver. But he did get his start in the Bugs, knocking off the Beatles. Recently in the store, though, we got something that topped them all. This is something called From Britain with Beat, and it is a Beatles knockoff album meant to either fool and or cash in on the Beatlemania craze. Looking at the cover, they didn't even try that hard. You know, you hear about Beatles mop top wigs being popular in the 60s. These look like they're actual mops on the top of these four dudes hanging out on the front cover. For their part, Discogs classifies this album as being from an unknown artist, so it is truly just something that was constructed by the label to cash in on the craze. Musically, though, I found some articles that point to the fact that some of the songs on this come from different bands that had recorded with different labels and were compiled by this particular label called Modern Sound. Now, in the liner notes on the back of this, Modern Sound says, "We do everything possible to make each one of our albums comparable in quality with any other album on the market. Continuing, every selection on every album has been recorded since 1962 using the finest recording studios, musicians, vocal groups, and lead singers in the country." So they do disclaim on the fact that this is not the Beatles, but you have to do some digging around on the back and the liner notes. But one look on the front for anybody who knows, especially nowadays, and you realize that this is not the Beatles. Of course, all you have to do is listen to the music and you realize the very same thing.
Can't buy me love. Oh, can't buy me love. Buy you a diamond ring, my friend, if it makes you feel alright. I get you anything, my friend, if it makes you feel alright. 'Cause I don't care too much for money, 'cause money can't buy me love.
Now, not all of the music on this album are Beatles cover tunes. There's one from the Stones, there's a Herman's Hermits song, and their own version of Tobacco Road. There's even 3 songs on here that were written by someone at the record label and just recorded willy-nilly by studio musicians. It's worth noting as well, on the back cover, they do not credit any songwriters, nor do they identify who these 4 dudes are on the front cover. So I think we're a little bit more savvy these days when we're seeing our albums and what may or may not be knockoffs. And I don't know as if we're ever going to see a phenomenon like the Beatles in the early 60s through the mid 60s taking off that will spawn so much attempt at cashing in with false, fake, and or counterfeit versions, or even these kind of knockoff sound-alikes. But in listening to this one, I gotta say this is probably one of the worst versions, both musically and visually, of a Beatles knockoff that I have ever seen.
Hey, you got that something
I think you'll understand when I feel that something. I want to